The Wildcat shuddered violently as cannon rounds tore through its tail section, trailing smoke like a broken kite string across the vast Pacific sky. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch watched in helpless horror as his wingman's plane disintegrated in midair. Pieces of aluminum fluttered in the wind, and then nothing, just empty blue and a memory extinguished. Another pilot gone, another life erased in less than 5 seconds. The Zero banked up effortlessly, already repositioning for its next kill. It wasn't even a fight. It was slaughter. Thatch didn't need to check his instruments or listen to the scattered calls over the radio. He already knew what they all knew. Deep down, the Japanese Zero was untouchable, faster, lighter, deadlier. Every time one of his pilots tried to turn and fight, the Zero was already behind them, fangs bared. The math was unforgiving. Engagement after engagement. The outcome never changed. His boys were flying outdated machines, fighting a war that had already moved on without them. He had seen it coming for months. Back in September 1941, before America had even entered the war, a thin folder stamped "Eyes Only" had landed on his desk. It had seemed surreal at the time. An intelligence report from China, filled with flight performance data on a new Japanese fighter, the A6M-0. The specs had looked impossible. A turning radius tighter than anything in the Navy's inventory. A climb rate that seemed to defy gravity. A combat range that could stretch across entire oceans. It read like science fiction. But today, in the unforgiving skies above the Pacific, fiction had become fact, and the cost was being paid in blood. Thatch pulled hard on the stick, trying to reposition. Smoke blurred the edges of his vision as he climbed, glancing below to count the remaining Wildcats. Too few, always too few. His voice, when it came over the comms, was calm, but inside, his stomach clenched like a fist. "We're pulling back. Regroup at 12,000 feet. He didn't have to say the rest. Everyone knew the score. Back on the carrier later that day, Thatch sat in silence, helmet resting on the table in front of him. His face, usually composed, was drawn and unreadable. Outside, the Pacific stretched into endless gray, mirroring the storm in his mind. The young pilot who had died was 23. His name was Jack. He had written a letter to his wife the night before, joking about how the coffee on the carrier tasted worse than engine oil. Jack hadn't seen the Zero coming. None of them did until it was too late. What haunted Thatch wasn't just the loss, it was the helplessness, the raw, undeniable truth that they weren't just being outflown. They were being outclassed, outmaneuvered, and outgunned in every sense. He'd spent his life mastering tactics, studying dogfights from World War I, drilling his men on formations like the Loughborough Circle and Finger Four. None of it mattered now. The old rules no longer applied. And that terrified him, because it meant that if something didn't change, these deaths would continue, one after another. Young men with call signs and grins and photographs in their lockers, reduced to wreckage on the ocean's surface. He couldn't live with that. Not as a commander, not as a man. He rose slowly, walked to the observation deck, and watched a pair of Wildcats returning from a late patrol. Even from a distance, he could see the heavy way they flew, the weariness in their wings. These weren't machines anymore. They were coffins, waiting for closure. What do you do when the enemy's better in every way? You could wait for better planes, you could ask for miracles from engineers and pray the Corsair or the Hellcat would roll off the line faster, but those were months away, maybe longer. His men didn't have months, they had days, hours, maybe not even that. And so Thatch did something else. He started thinking, not like a pilot, not like a tactician, but like a man searching for a way to cheat death using whatever tools he had left. And in that moment, the first seeds of an idea began to form. not fully shaped, not even conscious yet, but pressing at the edges of his exhaustion. A way to win, not by matching the zero plane for plane, but by changing the very shape of the fight. He didn't know it yet, but his greatest weapon wasn't on the flight deck or in a hangar or even in the air. It was waiting for him, quietly at home, in a drawer next to the salt and pepper shakers. Small, wooden, insignificant matchsticks. But that comes later. Right now, Jimmy Thatch was just a man walking the deck of a ship, haunted by the loss of a wingman, and quietly, and let me ask you something, because maybe this is the part where it matters to all of us. If you were in his position, outmatched, outgunned, watching the people you care about vanish one by one, would you accept it? Or would you start looking for a way out of the impossible? Even if it meant starting with nothing but a handful of matchsticks? September 22nd, 1941. The morning fog still clung to the hangars at Naval Air Station San Diego when the envelope arrived. It was thin, cream-colored, and stamped with red ink. Eyes only. Jimmy Thatch opened it with steady hands, his coffee untouched beside him. He scanned the pages once, twice, a third time. Then he set the report down, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the wall. He'd seen plenty of intelligence memos before, some helpful, most speculative. But this one was different. This one had numbers. The Japanese had a new fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M0. Reports were coming in from American volunteers flying in China, men who had gone to fight with the Chinese Air Force before the U.S. officially entered the war. And what they were seeing, it didn't make sense. A climb rate of over 5,000 feet per minute. A turning radius so tight it could outmaneuver anything the Navy had. Top speed, 330 miles per hour. Combat range over 1,200 miles, nearly double that of the Wildcat. Every line of data made Thatch's stomach tighten a little more. If the numbers were even half accurate, the zero wasn't just better, it was untouchable. And unlike American planes, it was already flying in combat, already drawing blood. He looked across his desk at a framed photo. His wife, his daughter, smiling on the beach. Behind them, a wildcat flying low over the surf, just a blur in the background. He had always loved that photo. Today, it felt like a countdown. The Wildcat was the Navy's frontline fighter, and it had been dependable, tough, rugged, able to take punishment. But in a turning fight, it was a brick. It couldn't climb like the Zero. It couldn't outturn it. And if it tried, it would be dead before it had a chance to realize it was in trouble. Thatch folded the report carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and locked it in his desk. Then he went outside and watched a group of young pilots finishing a ground drill. They were laughing, joking, shoulders relaxed, unaware of what was coming. They hadn't seen the data. They hadn't imagined what it would be like to face an enemy who was faster, lighter, and already killing men like them across the Pacific. He watched them longer than he needed to. That night, back home in Coronado, the sunset was soft and orange, the air thick with salt, and the distant hum of propellers. Thatch lived in a modest bungalow near the beach, a short walk from the base. He carried the report in his briefcase, even though there was nothing more to read. It was a habit now, like carrying a loaded pistol just in case. His daughter was already asleep when he got home. His wife met him at the door with a tired smile and a kiss on the cheek. Dinner was still warm, and the radio played swing music low in the background. For a while, they talked about nothing important. The neighbor's new fence, the price of bread, a letter from her sister in Ohio. But even as he listened, his mind kept circling back to the Zero. Later, when the house had gone quiet, Thatch poured himself a small glass of bourbon and sat at the kitchen table. He took out a notebook and began to sketch arcs, angles, converging paths. He wasn't sure what he was drawing yet, just trying to picture the fight differently. Not as a duel, but as a problem of geometry, of timing. Could two slower aircraft, working together, trap a faster one? Could positioning beat performance? He flipped the page and started again. It wasn't the first time he'd done this, but tonight felt heavier, more urgent. There was a deadline approaching, even if no one could see it yet. He imagined the Zero in motion, its nose turning tighter, faster. His pilots trying to match it, always a second behind, always too late. He wrote in the margins, "Don't turn with it. Force the Zero into a mistake." But how? In Washington, men were debating strategy, production numbers, the question of war itself. Here in Coronado, a man at his kitchen table was trying to figure out how to save lives with a pencil and a few pieces of paper. He thought about the report again. The range of the Zero meant it could strike targets far from any base. It could escort bombers across wide stretches of ocean. It could cripple American carriers long before the U.S. was ready to respond. And when it did, it wouldn't be a fair fight. He glanced at the counter, where a box of matchsticks sat near the stove. Something in him stirred. Matchsticks. They could represent aircraft, positions, paths. He reached for them slowly, like a man touching an idea before it slipped away. One by one, he began placing them on the tabletop, two side by side, one behind. He moved one forward, the other to the side, drawing invisible lines between them. What if? His wife walked in, half asleep, and paused at the doorway. "Jimmy," she said softly, "it's past midnight." He looked up, startled, then smiled. "I know," he said. "Just a little longer." She didn't ask. She never did. She poured a glass of water, kissed his forehead, and went back to bed. Thatch stared at the matchsticks again. It wasn't much, but it was a start, because in that quiet moment, beneath the hum of the fridge and the distant sound of waves on the sand, a simple truth was beginning to form. He couldn't build a better plane, but maybe, just maybe, he could build a better way to fight, and that would have to be enough. The days passed, then the weeks. By early October 1941, Jimmy Thatch had fallen into a routine that few people around him noticed, but one that was slowly consuming him. By day, he trained pilots, ran drills, and oversaw operations at the base. By night, after his wife and daughter had gone to bed, he would return to that small kitchen table, turn on the yellow lamp overhead, and open his notebook to a fresh page. The box of matchsticks stayed in the center of the table, a quiet collection of ideas waiting to be arranged. He never explained to anyone why he used them. It just worked. Something about the tactile nature of picking up each tiny stick, moving it across the wood, made the concepts real. He could simulate angles, turns, positions. He could see problems and possibilities that weren't visible in a classroom or on a chalkboard. The frustration came quickly. Night after night, Thatch built miniature formations, pairs, trios, staggered lines. He tried recreating classic fighter tactics, but none held up when he ran the scenario through. Every time he simulated a Zero attack, the result was the same. The Wildcat got caught in a turn and eliminated before its wingman could react. It wasn't just that the Zero was better. It was how much better it was. Any attempt at mutual defense that relied on quick response was doomed from the start. The Zero didn't give you time to respond. He kept notes obsessively. Diagrams filled his notebook, some with careful labels and measurements, others scrawled in the heat of thought, half erased and drawn again. He underlined words like angle, delay, separation. He circled concepts, cross-turn, overlap, trap geometry, and always, in the margin, a quiet, almost desperate refrain. What gives the slower plane a chance? It was a lonely kind of work, not just intellectually, but emotionally. There was no one to share it with, no one who truly understood the weight behind each matchstick. The other officers were still focused on improving existing tactics. Some were skeptical that any new method was even necessary. A few dismissed the zero as a fluke, an untested paper tiger. But Thatch had seen the data. He'd seen the zero in his mind again and again, closing in behind a wildcat, faster, tighter, relentless. He didn't need another pilot's opinion. He needed a solution. Some nights he barely noticed the clock ticking past midnight. Other nights his wife would come out of the bedroom, rubbing sleep from her eyes, to find him hunched over the table, one hand on his forehead, the other moving matchsticks like chess pieces. "You're at it again," she would whisper. He'd nod, half smiling. "Just one more try." She never scolded him. Instead, she'd wrap her arms gently around his shoulders, kiss the top of his head, and return to bed, trusting him to keep chasing whatever it was he was chasing. He wasn't always sure himself, but the stakes made the effort feel holy. Sometimes he imagined one of his pilots in the cockpit, 21 years old, sweating, his hands gripping the stick as a zero slid in behind him. In that moment, Thatch knew there wouldn't be time to think, only instinct, muscle memory. That meant any tactic had to be simple, executable, repeatable. The enemy had speed, the enemy had agility. What did he have? Discipline, teamwork, and maybe an idea. On the 7th or 8th night of his late-night sessions, something shifted. He was replaying a scenario with two matchsticks, side by side, about 1,500 feet apart, roughly the turning radius of the wildcat. He had a third stick representing the zero, moving in behind one of them. Out of habit, he rotated the first wildcat stick away from the zero's attack line. That's what pilots were trained to do: evade, create distance. But then he paused. What if the pilot turned toward his wingman instead? He adjusted the matchstick's position, swinging it inward instead of away. Then, carefully, he moved the second wildcat to mirror that turn, crossing behind the first. The two aircraft's paths now intersected, a crisscross, like scissors closing in the air. The zero, if it continued its pursuit, would fly directly into the firing line of the second wildcat. If it broke off, the formation could reverse, repeating the maneuver again. Thatch stared at the arrangement. Could it be that simple? He ran it again, and again. He moved the matchsticks at different approach angles, tried it against multiple attack vectors. Each time the same result. The enemy's advantage was blunted by the geometry. The formation turned the zero's superior agility into a liability. Every engagement became a 2-on-1. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he filled an entire notebook with variations of the maneuver. Timing adjustments, visual cues, optimal distances. He tested what would happen if the zero attacked from above, or if one wildcat got out of sync. He made notes on recovery paths, fallback positions, how to re-enter the weave after a break. He even gave it a name, not a dramatic one, just something simple and technical: beam defense position. Because at that point, it wasn't about ego or legacy. It was about saving lives, and maybe, just maybe, changing the outcome of the war. The next morning, over coffee, his wife asked him if he was feeling any closer to whatever he was trying to solve. He nodded slowly, the circles under his eyes dark, but his expression brighter than it had been in weeks. "I think I found something," he said. But he didn't elaborate. He wasn't ready yet. First, he had to prove it worked, and that meant taking it off the table and into the sky. But before we go there, let me ask you something. Have you ever stayed up late, long past, when logic said you should stop, chasing a solution no one else believed in? Because sometimes the breakthrough doesn't come from brilliance or talent. It comes from refusing to quit. from sitting with the problem just a little longer than anyone else. October settled into San Diego with a gentle chill in the air, the kind that made the ocean mist linger just a little longer on the rooftops. The thatch home, a quiet, modest house not far from the shoreline, had become more laboratory than residence. The kitchen table was no longer a place for family meals, but for warfare in miniature. Pencils, notebooks, rulers, and that ever-present box of matchsticks lay scattered across the wood, bearing witness to a man on the edge of discovery. The house was still. The base, just a few miles away, had gone quiet for the night. Jimmy Thatch sat hunched forward, elbows on the table, moving sticks in silence. His face was drawn, not with exhaustion, but with focus so intense it seemed to block out time itself. He had been rerunning the same scenario for hours. A 0 on the tail of a wildcat. The American pilot, by instinct, turned away, trying to escape, to shake the pursuer. But it never worked. The 0 always followed, always got the kill. There was no outrunning it, no outturning it. Then came the question that changed everything. What if you didn't run? What if instead of fleeing, the targeted pilot turned into his wingman? He placed 2 matchsticks side by side, 1,500 feet apart. That distance was intentional. It matched the wildcat's turning radius. If the planes were closer, they might collide. If farther, the 0 could slip between them. But at this distance, the geometry held. He moved the first stick forward, simulating a wildcat under attack. As the 0 closed in from behind, Thatch pivoted the stick left, into the path of its wingman. Then he moved the second wildcat toward the first, executing a mirror turn. The paths crossed. Their arcs overlapped. The 0, in hot pursuit, suddenly found itself flying directly toward the guns of the second wildcat. Thatch leaned back in his chair. There it was. An answer. Not perfect, not foolproof, but real. Something that could work without better planes, without radios, without luck. He tested the move again, and again. He moved the 0's approach angle, its speed, its altitude. Each time the formation adapted. As long as the 2 American pilots trusted each other and turned together, they could cover each other's blind spots. The maneuver didn't defeat the 0 by strength. It used its speed against it, turned its aggression into a trap. He began writing, fast, pages of notes, visual diagrams, variations, warnings. He tested scenarios where a 0 tried to break off or switch targets mid-attack. He tracked where the wildcat gunners should aim, how long the turn should last, when to reverse direction. He was no longer a man with matchsticks. He was a tactician building a weapon. He gave the move a name, simple, functional. Beam defense position. But it wouldn't stay simple for long. From the hallway, soft footsteps approached. His wife, in her robe, leaned against the doorframe. You found something, she said. He looked up surprised. How did you know? You're not muttering anymore, she said with a tired smile. You're writing. He smiled back. I think this might actually work. She stepped closer, looked down at the crisscrossed matchsticks, the sketches littered across the table. She didn't pretend to understand it, but she saw the look in his eyes, relief mixed with purpose, the look of a man who had been chasing a shadow for weeks and finally touched something solid. Will it keep them safe? She asked. There was a pause. It'll give them a chance, he said. That was all he could promise. But it was more than they'd had the week before. He stayed up through the night, not out of desperation this time, but momentum. The kind of creative high that only comes when all the pieces click into place. At dawn, he poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and stood on the back porch. The sun was low on the horizon, a soft orange strip bleeding across the Pacific. He breathed in the salt air, closed his eyes, and imagined two wildcats twisting through the sky, covering each other like dancers in a deadly waltz. He knew what would come next. Simulation wasn't enough. He needed to test it, really test it, against someone smart, someone skilled, someone who could break it, if it could be broken. A name came to mind immediately. Butch O'Hare. He was a natural, a gifted pilot, with fast reflexes and sharper instincts. Young, confident, maybe even a little cocky. If the beam defense position could stand up to O'Hare's best effort, it could stand up to anyone. Thatch finished his coffee, went back inside, and carefully packed the notebook into his flight bag. The matchsticks remained on the table, frozen in place. Two small wooden lines crossing in midair, representing a moment that might one day save lives. He didn't take them with him. They had served their purpose. The answer finally was out of his head and ready for the sky. And maybe this is the part that matters most. The idea that changed the course of aerial warfare wasn't discovered in a lab or a control tower or a war room filled with brass. It was born on a kitchen table, beside a cup of coffee and a box of matchsticks while the world slept. So let me ask you, have you ever been on the verge of giving up and then, in the quiet, found a solution that had been in front of you all along? Because sometimes victory doesn't come with a roar. Sometimes it arrives with the soft click of two matchsticks crossing paths. The wind over San Diego Bay that morning was sharp and clear, slicing through the clouds like a knife. The kind of day pilots loved. Visibility for miles, the sky a deep, endless blue. But for Jimmy Thatch, it wasn't about the weather. It was test day. He'd called in one of the most promising young pilots in the Navy, Ensign Edward Butch O'Hare. Sharp, fast, a natural. The kind of flyer who didn't need to think. He just flew. O'Hare had earned a reputation not just for skill, but for tenacity. If the new tactic could survive him, it could survive anything. Thatch had handpicked 3 of his best pilots to fly in formation with him. They would serve as the test group, executing the weave as he had drawn it up, drilled it, dreamed it. O'Hare would lead the opposing flight. 4 wildcats tasked with breaking the maneuver however they could. No restrictions, no handicaps. Just full-speed, real-world pressure. At 800 hours, the 4 wildcats and Thatch's group taxied out onto the runway. O'Hare followed moments later, his own aircraft gleaming under the morning sun. On the flight deck, ground crews watched curiously. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would rewrite aerial tactics. Thatch's hands were calm on the stick as they climbed to 15,000 feet. Below them, San Diego faded into a patchwork of rooftops, runways, and waves. Above them, only sky. The radio crackled. "All set, Skipper. Let's see what you've got." O'Hare's tone was playful, confident. Maybe too confident. Thatch smiled to himself. That was exactly what he needed. He and his wingmen took up the beam defense position, side by side, 1,500 feet apart. The spacing was critical, too close, and the turns would collapse inward. Too far, and the weave would break apart. They began their patrol, cruising in a straight line, waiting. O'Hare's voice came through again. "Coming in from the rear, high side." Thatch didn't reply. He didn't need to. He saw O'Hare's section diving toward his right wingman. Immediately, the formation turned. Thatch angled toward the oncoming threat, and his wingmen mirrored the move. The 2 wildcats crossed paths, each turning toward the other, their trajectories slicing the air in perfect symmetry. O'Hare pulled up sharply to avoid flying straight into Thatch's guns. "Not bad," he muttered into his mic. "Let's try that again." This time, he approached low, then swept up in a climbing spiral. Classic boom and zoom. But Thatch anticipated it. As the attacker closed in, The weave snapped into action again, and the crossing arcs forced O'Hare away. For 20 minutes, he tried everything. Straight runs, diving angles, staggered approaches. At one point, he even had two aircraft attack simultaneously from opposite flanks, trying to overload the weave. Nothing worked. Every time O'Hare or one of his wingmen committed to a line of attack, they found themselves staring into the nose of a wildcat, guns leveled, waiting. And this wasn't in combat, where chaos reigned. This was in controlled airspace, with full concentration, no real threat of death, and it still didn't work. O'Hare was one of the best, and the formation had him boxed in. After they landed, he climbed out of his cockpit and pulled off his helmet, sweat streaking his forehead despite the cool morning. "Skipper," he said, shaking his head, "it really works." Thatch raised an eyebrow. "You're sure?" "I couldn't get in without seeing one of your guys staring back at me," O'Hare said. "Every time I lined up a shot, your wingman was already in position." There was no fanfare, no applause, just a quiet nod between professionals. A recognition that something significant had just happened. Something that might shift the balance in the air. They debriefed in the ready room, walking through what had worked and what hadn't. O'Hare pointed out one or two timing issues, moments when a slightly delayed turn could have opened a window. Thatch took note of everything, refining the procedure down to the second. The success wasn't just in the maneuver, it was in how it felt. It gave the defenders options. For the first time since reading that report on the Zero, Thatch felt something strange creeping into his thoughts. Hope. Of course, the real test would come in combat. Drills were one thing. Survival under fire was something else entirely. But the foundation was solid. From that day forward, Thatch began incorporating the maneuver into his training sessions. He didn't push it too hard at first. He knew the culture of naval aviation well. Pilots were independent, proud, trained to fight with instinct and initiative. A tactic that required strict synchronization and mutual trust could be a hard sell. But slowly, steadily, he worked it in. He didn't call it the beam defense position anymore. Everyone else had started calling it something simpler, the Thatch weave. And though he never sought the name, it stuck. Because no one else had spent those nights with the matchsticks. No one else had stared at empty space and imagined a way to fill it with survival. The weave was more than a maneuver. It was a lifeline, built not in a lab, but in a kitchen, by a man who refused to believe that his pilots had no chance. It was a tactic born of desperation, but executed with precision. And it had just passed its first real test. Now, the next challenge loomed. War was coming, and with it, 1,000 zeros. So let me ask you this. If you had the chance to test your idea before it mattered, when the only thing at risk was your pride, would you do it? Would you let someone like Butch O'Hare try to tear it apart? Because that's where innovation lives, not in being right the first time, but in proving it when it counts. And for Jimmy Thatch, the proving ground had only just begun. By early 1942, the war had begun. Pearl Harbor was still smoldering in the minds of every American sailor, and the Navy, wounded but awakening, was expanding fast. New squadrons were being formed, new pilots trained, new carriers readied for battle. The days of tight-knit veteran crews were gone, replaced by the urgent churn of fresh faces, new names, and green uniforms. Fighting Squadron 3, Thatch's command was no exception. Most of his original pilots, his trusted veterans, had been reassigned, scattered across the Pacific to seed new units. What remained were rosters filled with newly minted aviators, men barely out of flight school, sharp, enthusiastic, and dangerously inexperienced. Among them was Ensign Mark Lawson, 22 years old, Midwest farm kid, tall, clean-cut, full of optimism. He had a strong record in training, fast reflexes, and a good eye for gunnery. But like many young men with talent, he hadn't yet learned the weight of fear or the value of humility. On his third day in the squadron, Lawson walked into a tactical briefing where Thatch was introducing a new maneuver. The chalkboard was filled with diagrams, intersecting arcs, timing intervals, separation distances. Thatch spoke in his usual calm tone, describing the need for tight coordination and trust between pilots. Lawson raised a hand. Sir, with all due respect, shouldn't we be training to outfly the enemy, not fly in patterns to dodge them? A few pilots chuckled. Thatch didn't. He looked at the young ensign for a long moment before replying. Flying smart, he said evenly, isn't the same as dodging. And you won't outfly the Zero. Not in a wildcat. There was a beat of silence. Thatch didn't embarrass him further. He simply turned back to the board and continued. But from that moment on, Lawson became his quiet project. Not to put the boy in his place, but to bring him up to speed before it was too late. Because combat was coming, and when it did, there wouldn't be time for pride. The squadron spent every available hour in the air. Practice weaves, wingman drills, simulated attacks. Thatch flew with every pair, personally instructing, correcting, demonstrating. He emphasized timing, how the weave only worked if both pilots committed at the same instant. He drilled them until the turns became instinctive, muscle memory written into their hands and eyes. Lawson, for all his initial skepticism, adapted quickly. He was sharp, no question. And to his credit, he didn't argue again. In fact, by the end of the second week, he asked to fly as Thatch's wingman. Permission granted, Thatch said. But be ready. They flew their first weave together over the open water west of Coronado. A mock dogfight. Another pair from the squadron played the attackers. Lawson was the bait, flying slightly ahead, drawing the pursuit. The moment the attacker latched onto his tail, Lawson turned inward. So did Thatch. The fighters crossed paths in the sky, and Thatch pulled the trigger. The attacker flamed out. Lawson's voice crackled over the radio, half disbelief, half awe. Sir, that was incredible. No, Thatch said. No, that was practice. Let's go again. They ran the drill 5 more times that day. By the end, Lawson had stopped doubting. In the ready room that evening, he pulled out a notepad and began sketching his own diagrams, refinements, timing notes, mental cues. Other pilots gathered around. They started discussing minor adjustments, angles of approach, how to signal a break visually if radios went out. The weave was no longer theory. It was becoming doctrine. And that was critical, because the Wildcat still hadn't changed. It was still outmatched, still slower, heavier, less agile than the enemy. But now its pilots had something more important than performance specs. They had a plan. Word about the tactic had begun to spread beyond the squadron. One evening, a visiting officer from another unit watched a training session and pulled Thatch aside afterward. You really think this will work in combat? He asked. Thatch didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed to Lawson, still on the flight line, walking back from his aircraft, helmet tucked under his arm. You see that kid? Thatch said. 3 weeks ago, he didn't believe this was worth practicing. Now, he won't fly without it. The officer gave a skeptical shrug. Let's hope that faith holds when the bullets are real. It will, Thatch replied, because it has to. They didn't know it then, but the test was coming sooner than expected. VF-3 had been selected for escort duty. Torpedo Squadron 3 was being deployed with their slow, vulnerable devastators to support a major operation near Midway Island. The Wildcats would be their only defense. Thatch gathered the squadron 2 days before deployment. He didn't give a speech, just a quiet briefing, his voice steady, his eyes on every man in the room. This isn't about flying acrobatics, he said. It's about staying alive. about giving each other a chance to fight another day. The weave isn't a magic trick. It's a partnership. You turn when your wingman turns. You trust the man beside you. That's how we get through what's coming. Lawson sat in the front row. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't need to. Outside, the deck crew loaded the last of the supplies. The sea was calm. The sun was setting behind the carrier, casting long shadows across the hangar deck. War was waiting just beyond the horizon. And this time, the Wildcats would meet it with something new. Not better engines, not sharper wings, but a tactic born on a kitchen table and drilled into their bones. So let me ask you this. If you had just days to teach someone something that might save their life, would you spend those days drilling the basics? Or would you try to give them something deeper, something that could turn fear into focus? Because that's what Thatch had done. And now his squadron was ready to fight. Together. June 4th, 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretched in all directions, a vast, glittering mirror under the morning sun. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese carrier fleet steamed forward, unseen but not unknown. The U.S. Navy had cracked their codes. They knew where the enemy would be. They knew when the strike would come. Now they just had to meet it. Aboard the carrier USS Yorktown, pilots from Torpedo Squadron 3, VT-3, stood ready beside their aging Douglas Devastators. Slow, under-armored, outdated, they were flying into history with wings made of tin and courage. Above them, circling in holding patterns, 6 F-4F Wildcats from VF-3. Thatch led the formation. At his side, Ensign Robert Ram Dibb. Behind them, 4 more Wildcats flown by young men who had never seen real combat. Somewhere among them was Ensign Mark Lawson. Thatch scanned the horizon from his cockpit. Eyes narrowed behind his goggles. The tension sat heavy in his chest. Not fear exactly, but responsibility. His job wasn't just to shoot back. It was to keep the torpedo bombers alive long enough to make their run. He knew what was coming. 15 to 20 Zeros had been spotted ahead, scrambling from the decks of Japanese carriers. They would fall on the Devastators, like hawks on wounded prey. And the Wildcats, just 6 of them, would stand in their way. "Stay tight," Thatch called over the radio. "We go in together." Below, the Devastators launched. They were sluggish in the air, barely faster than a crop duster with a torpedo strapped beneath its belly. Their only protection was the weave and the men who believed in it. As the bombers approached the Japanese fleet, the sky came alive. Zeros poured down from above, sleek, fast, glittering in the sun like silver daggers. They didn't hesitate. They dove straight into the formation, guns blazing. Tracer fire lit the sky. Planes twisted and scattered. Smoke trailed from torn fuselages. One Devastator erupted in flame before it could reach the halfway point. Another spiraled into the sea, its wings torn clean away. Break left!" someone shouted. "Oh, where are they coming from?" "They're everywhere." The Wildcats dove in. Thatch peeled toward the incoming Zeros, Dibb tight on his wing. As he banked, a Zero latched onto one of the bombers. Thatch called to his wingman, "Weave now! Ram! Turn into me! Go!" They executed the maneuver without hesitation. Thatch rolled left. Dibb turned right. Their paths crossed in the air like blades scissoring across the sky. A Zero pursued Dibb, lining up its shot until it flew directly into Thatch's sights. He squeezed the trigger. A burst of .50 caliber fire tore through the Japanese fighter's engine. The cowling exploded. Flames erupted from the fuselage. The Zero tumbled away, streaming smoke. Another bomber went down. The sky was chaos, planes darting and twisting. The ocean below dotted with fire and wreckage. The Devastators were being cut to pieces, but the Wildcats were holding. Thatch and Dib crossed again, dodging tracer fire, weaving like dancers in a deadly rhythm. Every time a zero got behind one of them, the other swung in, guns ready. It was violent, precise, terrifying. Another zero broke through and tried to follow Dib's turn. Thatch was already there. He fired a long burst. The zero's canopy shattered. The pilot slumped. The plane veered off and nose-dived into the ocean. "Two down," Thatch called out, his voice calm, steady. He didn't feel calm. His heart pounded in his ears. The G-forces pulled at his limbs with every turn. Sweat blurred the edges of his vision. But he kept flying, kept weaving, kept fighting. To his left, he spotted Lawson in a tight spiral, juking to avoid a tailing zero. The young ensign made a hard bank toward his wingman, who responded perfectly. They crossed, and the attacker flinched, pulling up, breaking off. Thatch smiled to himself. The kid had learned, but they were still badly outnumbered. 3 Devastators remained. 2 had already released torpedoes, their runs incomplete. The last one was trying to line up a shot, but couldn't hold a straight line long enough. Another zero dove toward it. Thatch was too far. "Ram, you're closer! Take him!" he called. Dib didn't hesitate. He surged forward, angled across the zero's dive path, and fired. Smoke trailed from the enemy plane. It twitched, hesitated, then broke apart midair, its pieces raining down into the sea. "Nice shot," Thatch said. "I owed you one," Dib replied. One of the Wildcats went down moments later, a bright orange fireball that vanished in seconds. Thatch didn't see who it was. There was no time to check. Only the next turn. Only the next cross. The weave kept going over and over, like a metronome against the storm. Every pass, every turn, forcing the zeros to react, forcing them onto the defensive. It didn't stop the losses, but it stopped the slaughter. In the span of 10 minutes, Thatch shot down 3 zeros. Dib got another. Lawson's section survived intact, despite being outnumbered 4-1. Most of the Devastators were gone, but not all. 2 had dropped their torpedoes. Whether they'd hit anything, no one knew. But they'd made it that far. And in the air, the Wildcats had done what no one thought possible. They had held. As the last zeros retreated, low on fuel and ammunition, Thatch eased back on the throttle. His hands were trembling now, not with fear, but with release. His body had been holding the tension for too long. Behind him, the survivors regrouped. A radio crackled in his headset. "Skipper, the weave worked." It was Lawson. Thatch closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the words settle. "Yes," he said, "it did." And it wasn't just theory anymore, it was real. So now I ask you, when everything around you is chaos, when the odds are stacked, the sky's on fire, and you're outnumbered, can you still trust the plan? Can you turn into your wingman, even when every instinct screams to run? Because that's what saved them. Not better planes, not sharper reflexes, just 2 pilots, flying into each other, trusting that together, they might survive. Smoke still hung in the air, like a veil, when the Wildcats touched down on the Yorktown's deck. The ocean below glittered with wreckage, twisted metal, torn wings, oil slicks. Some of the Devastators had made it back. Some never had the chance. Thatch climbed out of his cockpit in silence, his flight suit damp with sweat, his gloves still tight around his hands. He didn't speak right away. No one did. The surviving pilots moved slowly, their eyes distant, scanning the deck for faces that didn't return. Ram Dib was already waiting at the edge of the hangar, helmet under his arm. His face was pale, but his voice steady. "That's the first time I didn't feel completely out of control up there," he said. Thatch nodded. It wasn't a win, but it wasn't a massacre either. And that mattered. because just days before the assumption had been grim that in any engagement with Zeros, the Wildcats would suffer catastrophic losses. Outflown, outmaneuvered, outgunned, the skies would belong to the enemy. But today, something shifted. The Weave had spoken. It didn't make the Wildcat better than the Zero. It didn't change the physics of flight or reverse the laws of war. But it gave pilots a way to stay alive, to fight with geometry instead of raw power, to protect one another. And in that, it changed everything. Word spread quickly throughout the carrier. Pilots came to find Thatch, not just from VF3, but from other squadrons. They wanted to hear how it worked. They wanted to see the diagrams. They wanted to know if it was something they could do. Thatch didn't keep it to himself. He opened his notebook, walked through the timing, drew the arcs, described the principle. You don't need to be faster, he told them. You need to be together. Even the skeptics couldn't argue with the results. 3 Zeros shot down by Thatch, 1 by Dib. All 6 Wildcats returned to the carrier, bruised, battered, but flying. And that was something no one had expected when the day began. In the debriefing room, Lawson sat with his flight jacket still zipped, his hands folded tightly. His face showed the residue of adrenaline. His body still hadn't processed that he'd survived his first real combat, that he'd flown the Weave and it had worked. He looked across the table at Thatch, as if seeing him for the first time, not just as a commander, but as a man who had saved his life. Later that night, Thatch found him alone on the flight deck, staring out at the ocean. You did well today, Thatch said. Lawson didn't look over. It didn't feel like it. We lost almost all the bombers. Thatch stood beside him, the wind tugging at their flight suits. We did what we could, and we gave them a chance to get through. That's more than we could have done 2 months ago. Lawson turned to face him. Skipper, I didn't believe you. About the Weave. I thought it was just theory. Something from a classroom. Thatch smiled faintly. So did a lot of people. Lawson nodded slowly. Well, I believe now. They stood there in silence. The hum of the carrier, the only sound beneath the stars. The next morning, Thatch sat down to write his after-action report. He was meticulous, detailing how the maneuver had been executed under combat pressure, how pilots responded instinctively, how Zeros were forced off attack runs. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't claim the Weave was perfect, but he documented the facts. And when that report made its way through the Navy's channels, it lit up every command post it touched. Suddenly, commanders who had feared the Zero began asking about Thatch's maneuver. Squadron leaders requested copies of the diagrams. Briefings were updated, training curricula rewritten. The Weave was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming standard doctrine. And not a moment too soon, because the war was far from over. The Zeros would be back, again and again. But now, American pilots had something they hadn't had before. A chance. Not because they were stronger, not because they were faster, but because someone had refused to accept defeat. Because one man, late at night at his kitchen table, had picked up a matchstick and asked a better question. Not, how do I win? But how do I keep my wingman alive? That question changed everything. The story of Midway would go down in history as a turning point in the Pacific War, not just because of the ships sunk or the planes destroyed, but because of the ideas that emerged in its fire. Ideas like the Weave. It didn't look like much on paper. 2 planes crossing paths, a set of turns, a rhythm. But to the men flying Wildcats, it was life itself. And its message was simple. You're not alone. So, let me ask you this. In your own battles, whatever they look like, do you fly solo? Or do you weave? Do you turn toward the people beside you, trusting that if you protect them, they'll protect you? Because sometimes survival isn't about being the best, it's about being together. And that was the lesson Thatch gave to the sky. By August 1942, just 2 months after the Battle of Midway, the thatch weave had spread far beyond the decks of the USS Yorktown. It was being taught in squadron ready rooms across the Pacific. It was chalked onto blackboards in flight schools, from Florida to Hawaii. It appeared in typed-out tactical memos stamped "confidential," passed from hand to hand with increasing urgency. And most importantly, it was being flown. Marine pilots defending Henderson Field on Guadalcanal used it daily. They were outnumbered, flying wildcats against relentless Zero attacks launched from Rabaul. The odds were brutal, the conditions were worse, but the weave gave them a way to hold the line. Not every pilot got out alive, but many who did owed their lives to a tactic born from matchsticks. Even the Japanese noticed. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most decorated aces, encountered the maneuver firsthand over Guadalcanal. In his post-war memoir, he described his squadron leader, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, diving confidently onto a pair of wildcats, expecting the usual easy kill. But the wildcats turned toward each other, not away. Nakajima suddenly found himself staring into the guns of a second fighter. He pulled hard on the stick, broke off, and dove for safety. Sakai remembered his commander's face when he landed. He was furious. He had never been forced to retreat from an American fighter before. He raged about how it wasn't a fair tactic, how it felt like flying into a trap. Because it was. A trap not of deceit, but of design. For the first time, the Zero's greatest strength, its ability to outturn anything in the sky, was turned against it. The more aggressively a Zero pursued a target, the more likely it was to fly directly into the path of another wildcat. Japanese pilots didn't understand it at first. They called it ghosting, because every time they attacked one American, another would appear to block the shot. They adapted, of course, changed their tactics, became more cautious. But that hesitation alone was a small victory. For a force that had once flown with near impunity, being forced to think before engaging meant the dynamic had shifted. Back in the U.S., the Army Air Forces took notice. Though they operated different aircraft, the twin-engine P-38 Lightning, the rugged P-40 Warhawk, the principle of the weave applied just the same. Two planes working in tandem, supporting each other's blind spots, creating crossfire opportunities. Squadrons flying over New Guinea, the Solomons, and even North Africa began drilling the maneuver. Instructors stopped calling it the beam defense position. They called it the thatch weave. And they taught it like gospel. In some training squadrons, it became a rite of passage. A pilot hadn't really earned his wings, they joked, until he had flown the weave and felt it work. It wasn't just a tactic now. It was culture. And it was resilient. Because it didn't depend on aircraft performance. It didn't require advanced technology. It required coordination, discipline, trust. Two pilots turning toward each other in a moment of danger with no guarantee of safety. Only the knowledge that by protecting one another, they stood a chance. That truth transcended aircraft types and combat theaters. It worked in Wildcats, in P-38s, in Hellcats and Corsairs. Later, it would be taught to pilots flying jets. Even into the Vietnam War, Navy F-4 Phantom pilots learned modified forms of the weave, still using the same principles Thatch had drawn out in pencil 3 decades earlier. But the echoes went deeper than tactics. They reached into the hearts of the men who had once felt helpless. Pilots who had watched their friends die, unsure how to fight back, suddenly had a tool. Not a miracle, not a guarantee, but something real. Something they could do. It gave them agency. That's not a word used often in war stories. But it matters. Because for every pilot who climbed into a cockpit knowing he was flying the slower, heavier, lesser plane, it mattered to know there was still a way, that someone had found it, that someone believed enough in the lives of his wingmen to sit at his kitchen table and try. It gave them hope, and that hope echoed across the Pacific. Through radios, through notebooks, through the calm voice of an instructor at a training airfield. Turn when your wingman turns, they said. You trust him. He trusts you. That's how you live. So let me ask you this. In your own life, when things go sideways, when you're cornered, outmatched, overwhelmed, do you fly alone? Or do you weave? Do you rely on others, turn toward them when danger comes? Because sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in what you fly. It's found in who flies with you. And in that moment, somewhere high above the blue waters of the Pacific, the echo of matchsticks became a roar. John Thatch never imagined he would become a legend. He didn't think of himself that way. He wasn't interested in glory, medals, or magazine covers. He thought in terms of problems and solutions, of cause and effect. A fighter pilot, yes. But first and foremost, a tactician, a teacher, a man who understood that lives were equations waiting to be solved. And for him, the thatch weave wasn't a legacy. It was just necessary. But history had other plans. After Midway, Thatch continued flying, continued leading. He refined other tactics, helped train a new generation of Navy aviators. When the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair entered service, he was among the first to study how the weave could adapt to these faster, more powerful machines. He rose through the ranks. By the end of World War II, he was widely respected, not only for his combat skill, but for how he taught others to survive. In 1958, he appeared on the cover of Time magazine, not for his wartime exploits, but for revolutionizing anti-submarine warfare during the Cold War. But for the pilots who had flown behind him in 1942, he would always be the man with the matchsticks. He retired in 1967 with the rank of full admiral, and he never stopped believing in the power of preparation. In his final interviews, Thatch often downplayed the mythology of the weave. It wasn't magic, he said. It was just geometry. Just two pilots turning toward each other. But anyone who had flown it knew better. It wasn't just geometry. It was trust made visible. In April 1981, Thatch passed away just days before his 76th birthday. He was buried at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego, overlooking the Pacific. Fitting, perhaps. The ocean he had once flown over. The sky where his invention had turned fear into possibility. In 1984, the U.S. Navy commissioned a frigate in his honor, USS Thatch, FFG-43. The name was painted bold across its hull, but the real monument lived higher, above the clouds, in every modern Navy flight school, in every air combat doctrine lesson, in every simulator where young aviators still learn that when trouble comes, you don't fly away. You turn toward your wingman. That's the weave. It endures because it speaks to something deeper than strategy. It speaks to how we fight together. The F-22 Raptor, the F-35 Lightning II, the most advanced fighter aircraft in history, equipped with stealth, sensors, and guided missiles. Yet inside every training syllabus, there are still maneuvers that trace their lineage to that kitchen table in Coronado, California. Still, two pilots weaving across the sky. And beyond the military, the lesson lives on. Because life, like combat, is rarely fair. Sometimes you're flying the slower aircraft. Sometimes you're outnumbered. Sometimes you feel like no tactic will save you. But Thatch showed the world that when the odds are against you, you don't need the best gear or the fastest machine. You need the best idea and the courage to act on it, even when no one else believes, even when the sky is full of fire, especially then. His story is now taught not just in tactical briefings, but in leadership courses, history books, and documentaries. It's a case study in innovation under pressure, and not accepting that the way things are is the way they must remain. And maybe most importantly, it's a reminder that great ideas don't always come from labs or command centers. Sometimes they come from a quiet kitchen table, late at night, with a box of matchsticks, when no one is watching, when no one believes you can make a difference. But you do it anyway, because people are counting on you. So let me ask you one last time. When you face your own zero, whatever form that takes, will you turn and run? Or will you, like Thatch, sit down and look for a better way? Will you fight smarter? Will you protect the people next to you? Will you turn into the danger, not away from it, and believe that together you'll find a way through? The weave is still up there, in every formation, in every moment when one person says to another, "I've got your back." That's the legacy. Written not in textbooks, not even in the paint on a fighter's wing, but written in the sky.